need help in a lot of things. Do my recovery change? What's the first step for me, man? I need help in a lot of things. Do my recovery change? What's the first step for me, man? I need help in a lot of things. Do my recovery change? What's the first step for me, man? I need help in a lot of things. Do my recovery change? What's the first step for me, man? Sometimes when I'm in jail, it can get kinda hectic. But if you get respected, you gon' get well respected. I tried to call collect and I'll never get accepted. Don't even get to tripping when the player get rejected. And when you be in jail, you gon' trip off a lot of spit.
There was a time, not very long ago, when we had no treatments for drug abuse. No successful treatments for drug abuse. In fact, there was a phrase that described that time. Once a junkie, always a junkie. And unfortunately, that phrase basically was believed by all the players involved, whether it was the medical profession, whether it was the mental health profession, whether it was the public, whether it was policymakers, and unfortunately, even addicts themselves. In short, as recently as 1955 or 1960, we had no successful treatments for substance abuse, and that phrase described the fact that if you were actively involved in serious substance abuse, there was very little likelihood that you would recover from that. And in that historical context, substance abusers themselves came together and essentially developed a way of trying to change their lives. And of course, we have other examples of that in the great tradition of AA, which was also a self-help development to deal with alcoholism. And of course, those examples really just reflect the fact that there are times in society when it cannot offer any help for certain subgroups of people. In fact, even those groups of people may be stigmatized as, for example, heroin addicts had been for a number of years. And so that without mainstream society being available to help the addict, they found a way to help themselves. Now, all of this is to say that when we now, after some 40 years, talk about the therapeutic community or try to teach the therapeutic community or train in therapeutic community practice, we recognize that in its beginnings, it did not begin from any theoretical basis. It began from practice. People living together, learning how to change each other's behavior and attitudes on a daily basis. And all of the elements that entered into that daily living, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all of the elements that gradually became stable activities, essentially define the therapeutic community program. And though the therapeutic community doesn't begin from a blueprint, didn't begin from an academic theoretical position, the power of that approach, documented through research, which demonstrated that individuals who, in fact, lived in therapeutic communities and stayed there at least some sufficient period of time, began to show remarkable changes in lifestyle and were successful.
This year I've had some experiences that have at least answered some of the questions that I think I've asked for a long time. When I was standing out there listening to Arnold run down about my peace marches and the signs, a sign came to mind that a friend of mine used to carry on every demonstration. And it was a quotation from a poem by, I think it was William Carlos Williams. It said, "We must love one another or die." And it was very frustrating. I never quite knew. And I think that I've gotten the answer this year. I've learned what it means to be loved and to love and to share that kind of experience. And I'm very grateful for that, because I think that's probably the answer that I was looking for all the time that I ran around being addicted to one thing or another.
So we have some 40 years of research which document the effectiveness of the therapeutic community, which is following clients, going through that treatment, and then following them out 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years, and showing that they are living different and positive lives. All of that begins as a kind of self-help, naturalistic response to a very, very painful life that individuals were living, and where the mainstream society, medical society, mental health society, didn't have much to offer. Today, in talking about, well, what are the essential elements of this rather, in my view, rather remarkable approach, so this way of talking or teaching about the therapeutic community really represents an articulation of what it is and what it does from a study of that approach. The study being both clinical experience and experimental research experience. And of course, the way we're going to now talk about it is from the standpoint of a kind of a theory. That is, we now think we understand what this approach is, and we think we can articulate that in terms of what we would call a kind of theory, and then essentially outline some of the elements which we consider to be essential to an effective therapeutic community as to and why it produces change in the individuals. So when we talk about the essential elements of a therapeutic community, we're really talking about our best understanding now from research and clinical experience of what a therapeutic community is, how it works, and why it's successful. I frequently, in recent years, I talk about, during my teachings, why we do what we do in the therapeutic community. So this time together in discussing the therapeutic community is really going to be a kind of theoretical articulation of the therapeutic community and illustrating where we can the relationship between what this theory is and how it works and why it works. Everything that is done in a therapeutic community is done for a purpose. Every element of a therapeutic community essentially has a purpose. And that purpose is best understood in terms of what the therapeutic or educational impact of that element is. Therapeutic communities which cannot essentially explain why they do what they do often don't know what they're doing then. So the key to that question, why we do what we do, is essentially describing the key elements of the therapeutic community and what its purpose is. And by the purpose, we mean what's the therapeutic or educational intention of that element. Now, when we say that, namely that everything has a purpose which explains why we do what we do, we're really talking about a perspective. Therapeutic community has a perspective, an overarching view, which governs why it does what it does, why it is structured the way it is structured, why the program day unfolds the way the program day unfolds. That perspective, which is an overarching view, really can be broken down into four major subviews. One is how the therapeutic community sees the disorder that it is treating, namely the view of the disorder. Unlike many other approaches to substance abuse, treating substance abuse disorder, therapeutic communities see the disorder, the chemical dependency, as a disorder of the whole person. So a client may come in presenting substance abuse as their problem. A staff person may ask an individual, why are you here? And the individual says, I'm here because I use drugs. And the staff person will say, you're really here to change yourself. To suggest right at the outset that the individual essentially is really dealing with something larger than their drug abuse.
Coming here, it was brought to light that I have a behavior problem. It wasn't the drugs, it was my behavior.
The counselors explained to me that this was a whole person program. This is a program where we not only deal with the drug problems, but we deal with the behavior problems that led you to the drugs in the first place.
You only had to change one thing about yourself, and that was everything about your behavior. And that's true. I mean, 5% of it is your drug addiction. The other 95% of it is your behavior.
It wasn't just quitting the dope, it was changing my behavior.
So therapeutic communities, as that first important view, have a view of the disorder. The disorder is a disorder of the whole person. And that means not only the issue of their using drugs, but the way they think, the way they handle their emotional life, the way they handle their social life, their negative values or absence of values. They may even have spiritual problems. So when an individual comes into a therapeutic community to be treated for substance abuse, basically what we say is that the problem is not the drug, the problem is the person. And it is true that as part of that disorder, there's a physical aspect to the disorder, frequently. The individual may be an active abuser so that they may actually be addicted in the conventional sense of that word. And it may be for a brief period of time as part of the approach they have to get de-addicted. But the disorder essentially goes much beyond their physical dependency. It goes in many ways to the very way in which they have been thinking, feeling, and dealing with their lives. Now, why is that important? If you wanted to understand what a therapeutic community is and its essential elements. Because if the view of the disorder is that it's a whole person, and in effect, that if we're going to treat this disorder, we have to be treating the whole person. And that means changing the way they think, changing the way they handle themselves as emotional people, changing the way they handle themselves as social people. One can get this immediate sense that this isn't simply a question of abstinence. In fact, remarkably, therapeutic communities take the position that the individual has to become abstinent fairly quickly. Either they have to come into the treatment program already, let's say, detoxified from their drug use, or if they're not, they've got to get detoxified in the first week or 10 days or 2 weeks of their stay in the program. So for therapeutic communities, abstinence is a prerequisite for treatment, which makes the point that you first have to get clean, then you can undergo your treatment, namely undergo the process of changing your life in this 24-hour, 7-day treatment. This view of the disorder then, as a whole person, where we know this individual is going to have to change a lot about who they are, tells us that, of course, then, they've got to be in a setting where all of who they are can be displayed, if that's your view of the disorder. If you decide that we have to see the way this individual displays negative thinking, we have to see the way this individual handles their emotions in some immature way, well, you're more likely to see that wide array of characteristics in the client which kind of define the disorder in a social situation, living in a social life with other people. So in many ways, it's important to recognize that based on a view of the disorder as a disorder of the whole person, it becomes kind of intuitively obvious to an observer, how would one treat a whole person? You certainly wouldn't likely treat that 2 hours a week in individual counseling, or let's say even 3 hours a week of group counseling. Not that those particular activities or treatments or treatment approaches are not working, they may be very good. But if you're trying to address the whole person, you're certainly not going to get them in 1 hour a week when you got another 167 hours. You need to see them, in many ways, essentially unfolding, displaying themselves 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to a wide variety of other people who are also doing the same thing and showing their behaviors and attitudes. It's living in that social situation that gives you and them the opportunity to essentially display their disorder, and that also then, of course, creates the opportunity to modify, change, correct, or improve the disorder. Let's talk a little bit more specifically about the disorder, but in terms of, well, what are some of the typical characteristics that actually need to be changed when we talk about the disorder? Well, a good way to think about this is to think about what are typical ways that individuals who have this disorder think. How do they handle their emotions? And some of that can really be summarized really in terms of some broad terms like immaturity or personality, but I don't want to get too jargonized on this. Good way to understand is point to some specific characteristics. For example, a prominent characteristic that needs to change if the individual is going to essentially overcome this disorder has to do with tolerance for frustration, delay of gratification. Now, what we're talking about is a characteristic which says that the individual has difficulty in dealing with any kind of impediment, any kind of frustration which would not allow them to have something that they want when they want it.
I basically wanted what I wanted, you know, when I wanted it. And that, and just knowing that I've got to start from scratch this time. And I can't have everything that I want, you know, and that was probably the hardest thing for me in this program.
That difficulty in dealing with frustration, both clinical experience and research experience, pretty much tells us that that's a very important characteristic in many addicts or people with substance abuse disorder. Teaching them to increase their tolerance for frustration, increase their capability for delaying gratification. This characteristic, like several other characteristics that I'll provide as an illustration, may have in fact been a problem for the client long before they used drug abuse, but it's also true that some of these characteristics that we'll talk about may first appear after the client, the individual, has been seriously involved in substance abuse for some years. So for the moment, it's not relevant as to whether these characteristics precede or follow drug use. It's only important for the moment to recognize as part of the whole person disorder, if the individual is going to change, they're going to have to essentially display these characteristics so that they can be seen and changed in a social setting. Many of our substance abusers who enter therapeutic communities have low self-esteem. That is, at the heart of the matter, they don't value themselves very well, or they have difficulties seeing that.
My self-esteem was very low. You got to know when you're on drugs, it kind of drain you and it take everything away from you.
I was tired of being who I was, knowing that the person I was wasn't any good.
They taught me how to love myself through their love. They loved me until I could love myself, because I didn't see anything that was worthy in me.
Research documents, of course, the validity of these characteristics for most addicts who have been seriously involved in addiction for a number of years. And I should point out that therapeutic communities are in many ways the treatment which has been identified with treating the most serious addicts over time. Low self-esteem is one of those characteristics. So that means that your treatment approach, in this case the therapeutic community, has to be capable of identifying the low self-esteem in the client or the poor tolerance for frustration, and arranging somehow in the social and psychological environment of the client a way in which they can begin learning how to acquire self-esteem, how they can overcome or strengthen their tolerance for frustration. A third characteristic, which is prominent in substance abuse disorder, is difficulties with authority. A lot of our clients, or a lot of the people who have serious substance abuse disorder, have histories of difficulties with authority. In many cases, it may go back to early years when their first problems with parents, and then schools, and difficulties in schools, and then later on with the police.
I don't like the cops, and, you know, I frown on authority figures.
Everybody who was grown up or had a position of authority, I rebelled against immediately, instantly, you know. They could be right, and I still seen them as being wrong.
But what I ended up doing was rebelling against anybody who was trying to tell me anything.
That means, again, if you can identify and recognize this characteristic, which also contributes to the disorder, you know that you have to have a treatment approach that basically is capable of addressing their problems with authority. So many of the elements, as we'll talk about a little later on, of the therapeutic community program, the treatment model, if you like, are really designed to basically address characteristics like problems with authority, or problems with tolerance, or problems with low self-esteem. One of the characteristics that clients themselves show a very high consensus on when you ask them, what problems do you have in addition to your substance abuse that you really feel has been difficult in your life, has been really problematic for your life? The one that they most often talk about is being responsible, responsibility. They will talk about how they have been irresponsible in their lives, or how they have to learn to be responsible in their lives. Now, if you listen again to this theme of whole person disorder and the characteristics that make up that disorder, you quickly move to the conclusion that you need a treatment approach that will essentially help the individual focus on becoming responsible in the therapeutic community, because that's a characteristic that needs to change. And other related characteristics that we see where it's been serious substance abuse disorder: poor impulse control.
I started acting out really young. I remember cutting a girl's ponytail off in first grade in school. Just impulsive behavior. That same year, I stole my teacher's wallet in school and bought all the kids, ice cream and stuff at lunch.
I can remember getting suspended from communities. The TC actually sanctioned me and suspended me, and I had to physically move out of the building for beating my cellie up. It was some ridiculous behavior when I look back. He was spitting in the sink, brushing his teeth and spitting in the sink. So I got up off my bunk and I just walked over and slapped the, out of him.
I get a call from up the street saying that, he's up there high on PCP and broke out somebody's window, So when I get up there, there's like all kind of cops up there. And so I'm like pissed off. So we get into an argument and like he pushed me out the way and I like stabbed him.
Another is being unrealistic. That is the way they measure their aspirations relative to their resources is essentially not realistic. They have a wide divergency between where they are at a particular moment. They may not even have a high school diploma, but if you ask them what do you want to do when you get out of this treatment program, they'll say, I want to be a lawyer. And so their whole perception of themselves in terms of what they want to do in life, or what they want to be in life, or who they think they should be in life, and what their current resources are, that whole perception is a very, very disparate one.
I made checks, do taxes, sell drugs, buy cars, sell cars. Insurance. And all at the same time that I'm doing that, I can also hold down an 8-hour job. I can do schoolwork all day long. I can go to school, I can stay. I didn't been to college. I can do that. I have no problem with that.
But you've been in prison.
Yeah, I've been in prison.
What am I missing here?
To learn to be realistic, see where I am, who I am at any particular moment in my life is a very critical objective in the therapeutic community.
I've always knew that the sky was the limit for me. I just didn't want to do nothing else. I didn't want to do nothing else. It attracted me to be out there in the lifestyle. That was attractive. I didn't know the downfall of it. All I knew was that I seen people with jewelry, kicking it, happy, got money, could buy anything they wanted, and that's what I wanted to do. I knew there was more. I could have been anything, but that's where I wanted to be, and I chose to stay there because I wanted to stay there, even after the fact that I knew that I would end up in prison again, or that I would go somewhere else.
You've been in prison for 10 years. You can say to yourself anything that you want. The fact is that if you would have had the brains and you would have exercised that intellectual muscle, you could have made the money that you say you want and that you desired in a way that would have brought you satisfaction and a lot of rewards. You didn't do it. You can talk to yourself until you're blue in the face about your intelligence, but there's something stopping you from being able to actualize it.
Another part of that being realistic is also their judgment about how they see the world affecting them and how they affect the world. They don't really see the world in terms of how it actually is, and they don't have a very clear sense of how their behaviors and attitudes are being affecting people, and also how people's behaviors and attitudes are affecting them. So when we talk about realism and getting realistic, we really mean helping the individual begin to make a much better appraisal about what their current resources are, what they can do and what they should be doing to take the next step in life, and that is having achievable goals and goals that essentially they can work on a daily basis. Now, when you think about some of the statements I just made, you can recognize that, well, if that's part of the disorder, you can see that we need a social environment in order to essentially address those characteristics. A lot of our people in substance abuse disorder have difficulty in coping with feelings. Now, what we mean by feelings is we mean those words that really stand for very recognizable experiences. Disappointment, joy, affection, vulnerability, worry, fear, anger. Well, a lot of our people can display anger, you know what I mean? They have that, and it seems to be the one feeling that they can identify and frequently display, and the associated attitude, which is hostility. But the other feelings, the whole array of other feelings, they often don't know that either that they have them, or if they know that they have them, they don't easily identify them, or if they can identify them, they don't appropriately communicate them. In fact, most of their emotional communication may come out all around anger.
I can't even say what I'm feeling because the only thing that I'm used to feeling is anger, so everything just comes out as anger for me.
It taught me how to deal with my anger because a lot of times I used anger to camouflage other emotions that I had because I didn't know any other way to express but anger.
I kept everything inside and I never really felt anything. I mean, I went through the motions and I said all the words I needed to say, but I never actually really felt anything.
Now, if we know or believe that part of the substance abuse disorder involves learning how to identify and communicate feelings, the whole array of feelings, positive and negative, so to speak, then, of course, you can see that the treatment approach has to be one in which a lot of those feeling situations can be surfaced. That's one of the reasons the elements of the therapeutic community are designed, in fact, to produce feelings in people, in the hope that, A, they'll begin to experience those feelings and then learn how to appropriately express them.
Growing up, it was been hard for me to express my feelings. And so I kept everything inside. And now lately I've been finding out that my feelings, I can't stuff anymore, especially since I'm not using drugs. When I was using drugs, there was no feelings either because I didn't feel anything. And so now that I'm clean and not using drugs, then it kind of makes it more difficult to hide my feelings. So now I'm just really emotional. Sometimes I get because from stuffing so long, it just comes out. Sometimes it's hard to control.
When I had feelings that I couldn't deal with, I self-medicated. And through all that self-medication, I ended up just stuffing those feelings. And then when I started to have some recovery behind me, all of those feelings came up.
During the prison project, I had allowed myself to actually feel. But by doing that, I had allowed myself to actually feel the things that I had actually done.
Another very important characteristic that defines the disorder is coping mechanisms. That is, typically substance abusers have tried to deal with achieving what they want to achieve at any moment in life with dishonesty, manipulation, and self-deception. Now again, I'm not for the moment stressing whether these characteristics precede or follow active drug use. We only know that they're prominent among substance abusers. And this is one of the characteristics that is most recognizable to observers, and that is that substance abusers have been dishonest, have been manipulating, have been deceptive. They've deceived themselves as well as deceived other people. So lying has been a prominent characteristic which is embedded in that.
Yeah, I think I've probably been dishonest most of my life, ever since as a young kid. Just lying, a lot of times being dishonest seemed the easier way out.
And act as if, right? Well, I learned how to lie, and it just kept going and going, and I was a pretty good liar.
I raised my children in that type of background, a lot of lying and deceit.
I was so dishonest that
I believe my own dishonesty. I used to make up stuff and believe it myself.
I can remember being in a TC in the prison in 1994, and this elder named Gary McDaniels, he gave me the pitch. He looked at me and said, "Hey, Keeler, how come every word that comes out of your mouth is a lie? And no one's ever called me a liar before." I think I was 32 years, 37, whatever. It was 11 years ago, and I can't recall anybody ever calling me a liar before. But this guy, man, this little skinny, frail cat in front of all the fellows called me a liar. And I think at that point I had to make some decisions, because I told him if he came back to work the next day, I was going to kill him. And he came back to work the next day. And then I had to lie again by not doing it. I remember coming up with all these excuses. I want to go home. You know what I'm saying? You ain't worth it. You know what I mean? But the fact of the matter is his truth became bigger than mine. You know what I mean? I had to come back and say, man, I'm a liar, man.
And so, if we say again that this is a very important characteristic that defines the disorder, the treatment approach, in this case the therapeutic community, has to be capable of essentially surfacing this, having individuals see that they actually do this, that they are manipulating, that they are deceptive or could be deceptive.
When I first came to the program, and you were one of the main people I looked up to and I used to listen to all the time. But as we started going on in the program, I started seeing little things, man. You know, what I see you say, what I see you do is two different things.
Is that true, Earl? Now, because I heard what you were saying. Is that true that, you know all the things to say? You're saying all the things that, quote-unquote, staff might want to hear. And then when you get around the corner, you're doing things differently?
I think sometimes it might be true. That's all. Hey, that's not. The focus is on me.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
I'm leaving it there.
Okay, you can respond.
I could respond any kind of way.
In the therapeutic community, as we'll come to talk about it, one of the real requirements is that the individual has to practicing absolute honesty as an individual. It's not simply to have them have the nice value of honesty, although that's critical. But when we say we demand honesty, absolute honesty in the program, is because we're really addressing the disorder. It's not simply that we want an honest environment. We do. But we really are essentially, as a first requirement, say you have to learn absolute honesty because it's been the dishonesty that's been part of your disorder. Another important characteristic is guilt. Guilt, when you use that word, you're really thinking about a complex emotion. We said a moment ago that an overriding characteristic is that substance abusers have difficulty in handling their emotional life, identifying emotions, communicating them appropriately. Guilt is a very complex emotion. And we used to think, because of the rather negative behavior, the infrequently or often social deviant behavior, that substance abuse disorder was simply a variation on sociopathic personality disorder or psychopathic personality disorder. Or today we have the diagnosis, in formal psychiatric terms, of antisocial personality. And behind that, the history of diagnosis, particularly with respect to this diagnostic category, always implied that if the picture looked sociopathic or psychopathic, or maybe even antisocial today, it implied that the individual didn't seem to have any real capacity for guilt. The thinking being is that, we behave correctly in the world, we don't do bad things to one another, we don't even do bad things to ourselves because there's a part of us that says that's wrong to do. And that's the issue of around guilt, and we used to think because they have such negative behavior, they frequently display such negative behavior, stealing, lying, manipulating family members, stealing money from family members, and much worse and much more devastating kinds of social behavior. We used to say, gee, how can that behavior mean anything other than the fact that they were kind of sociopathic and psychopathic and maybe couldn't change? Well, we used to believe that until, in fact, therapeutic communities, for one, and I think most dramatically demonstrated that individuals who essentially presented that picture for many years, when they finally lived through a long therapeutic community, showed such transformation that we had to revise our thinking around this. And that is, The problem is not that substance abusers have an incapacity for guilt. It's that what we've learned is that they don't deal with guilt very well. They don't cope with guilt very well. But it's not a capacity problem. And it's simply a kind of an extension of their general problem of managing feelings. And guilt is a particularly complex feeling. Over the years, clinical experience suggests there are at least three kinds of guilt that need to be addressed in substance abuse disorder, and particularly in therapeutic communities. One is guilt to the self. And that usually translates into the idea that a lot of our people that we treat essentially feel that they have thrown their lives away, that they have not used themselves in the best way, did not achieve what they should achieve, did not become the person that they thought they should become.
I need to contribute again to something worthwhile. My life hasn't meant much, you know, over the past 50 years. If I look back and say, you know, what did I do in my 50 years?
Guilt to the self, while all guilt is the same in terms of a basic experience, it's really the target of the guilt that becomes particularly important in treatment, which is if the individual is guilty to themselves, then something about what we do in treatment has to be able to help the individual not only see that guilt to themselves, but to, in fact, do new things, behave in new ways that in many ways counteracts that guilt to the self. One of the reasons, for example, that therapeutic communities insist on the individual kind of completing the treatment, and it's a long treatment in many cases, many, many months, but staying in the program and completing the treatment, because many of our people will say that they have actually never completed anything. And that has essentially left them with a kind of guilt to themselves. And we know if an individual has guilt and they don't handle guilt very well, it'll become a trigger for other destructive behavior like drug use. So one of the reasons we want people completing treatment is not because it's simply a good thing on the obvious level to complete treatment, but we know we're addressing a very specific characteristic for many of our people who have not been very successful at completing anything, whether it was school or work or any other major kind of legitimate activity. Completing treatment in itself not only provides a self-esteem around that, elevates self-esteem, but basically begins to moderate the individual's long-term problems with guilt to the self. They also have guilt to significant others. Here the target is not so much directly to myself, but the people that I've hurt in my life, the people I've disappointed in my life.
Oftentimes, you know, I sit back and think about, you know, how my selfishness impacted the lives of people I claim to love. You know, I have a son that's 23 years old, and you know, I got a total of 22 years in prison. You know, so you know, how well do I know my son?
My 14-year-old, he went to court yesterday for assault with a deadly weapon. So I don't know what happened yet. I'm really disappointed that I feel like a lot of it is my fault. I feel like I have guilt because I'm not there.
We all understand something about that guilt, and in that sense, you know, the issue is how do we get the individual to begin behaving, helping them behave in ways in which they are no longer, in fact, hurting other people, and then ultimately what it is they need to do with other people in terms of essentially making amends and so on, as AA talks about, to moderate the impact of that guilt to significant others. And then a third area is a lot of our people have guilt which is more anonymous. That is, that they have hurt people and the world in terms of, I don't even know the people that I have hurt. And that usually relates to negative behaviors. Maybe they've been engaged in social deviance and criminality, and they've robbed people or burgled people or mugged people, stolen things from people that they don't even know. And so that they have a general kind of guilt to society, if you like.
I grew up without a father. And through my sickness, and I'm trying to say this without saying this, that I caused other children, to grow up without a father, and I caused, mothers to have to, bury their children, man, And that stuff there, man, that's we have come to accept, parents bury children so much in the inner city, and my role, and in that, it bothers me to this day because I know how my life was impacted for the lack of a father, and my role it caused somebody else to, come up, the way I did, man.
And a related guilt, actually, which is a kind of fourth area, is the guilt that individuals can even develop in the program itself. Therapeutic community sees itself as community. We're going to talk about that. And the individual members of that community can be engaged in behaviors that actually run counter to the expectations of the community, and that can produce guilt to the community, where we mean the therapeutic community itself. But the whole picture about guilt is it's a complicated feeling with different targets, and much of what we do in treatment has to be able to help the individual see that they have those guilts, make sure that they don't, in effect, try to deal with those guilts in the usual negative, self-destructive ways that they have in the past, but can deal with it much more constructively. The phrase that captures the problem of guilt in therapeutic community, that we often see engraved on signs, even in the therapeutic community environment, is that guilt kills. And what that means, it's describing the typical kind of negative escalation of effects when an individual begins with a small guilt and doesn't handle that very well. They might have taken something from someone, or they might have even had some thoughts about using drugs, and that starts to create a guilt. If they don't handle that guilt in a constructive way, then they'll do something to escape that guilt. Usually what they'll do is either get more secretive or hiding, and that in itself will produce more guilt. And then if they don't deal with that guilt, that'll escalate into even another more complicated way of escaping guilt, until ultimately you see individuals thinking about either leaving treatment or using drugs and so on. And if you follow that, small guilt leading to a way of trying to escape it, that in itself producing larger guilt, and then that in itself maybe even leading the individual to try to run away completely. One of the ways we see this kind of guilt kills phenomenon in the real world outside of treatment is that a client with substance abuse disorder may in fact use, after being, let's say, clean for a few days or a week, then maybe slips and uses a drug, and immediately there's going to be a guilty component to that, and if they don't somehow deal with that, if that guilt feeling doesn't get interrupted, the next thing they know is that they've got to do something to sedate themselves, get away from it. That very frequently means more use of drugs. So if I just slipped once, I may as well go down the whole toilet, you understand, that as a way of essentially anesthetizing themselves from the painful discomfort of the guilt that they feel. So that guilt kills really is a dramatic phrase to describe escalating destructive behavior, because at each point the individual hasn't been dealing with the guilt.
If you're not grounded, then it's subject to take you out, So it's very important when you're dealing with guilt that you really have to have some people, a support team, somebody that you can always follow up and say, hey, this is what I feel like, because I didn't know I was going to feel this feeling all over again, I didn't know I was going to feel the feelings that I felt when I smoked my mother's house up, my brother's house up. Just the guilt of me knowing better.
Well, why fuss with this particular characteristic? It's a major one. And in the therapeutic community treatment, it has to be capable of essentially surfacing, as we've been saying throughout for all of these characteristics, surfacing the client's guilt, and then, of course, helping them deal with it in a much more constructive way. That's one of the reasons in therapeutic communities there's a great focus on raising individuals' awareness about anything in the environment that might be negative in that environment, in a therapeutic community. They're typically compulsive about this. Anything in an environment, in this environment, which may be counter to the expectations of the environment, the rules and expectations of the environment. The individual is obligated to address that, to speak to another peer member, to speak to a staff member. If they see, let's say, someone talking about drug use or talking about leaving the program, or talking about in some negative ways about some other people, if the observer sees that and says nothing about that, the therapeutic community position is that that likely will essentially produce a small ingredient of guilt in the observer, and that in turn then, if they don't deal with that guilt, will essentially begin affecting them in negative ways. So we have a word in the therapeutic community as part of its theory and practice, which is you cannot let any negativity in the treatment program simply unfold without addressing that. If you're doing that, you are condoning. So we say in the therapeutic community, no condoning. But it's not simply to have a clean environment. Of course it means that. But because deep under that word really means that our people do not tolerate condoning very well. They do it, but if they condone, they then become part of the negative process because their own guilt about seeing something wrong and not saying anything about that will begin producing a negative effect in them.
I saw you dance all around it, but tell us again why you can't support? I'm not sure I understand.
Why I have a hard time taking it to the next step, going to staff with it?
Yeah.
It's just, it leaves a bad taste in my mouth.
How about stopping the behavior before it escalates into something else? All right? How about we nip the behavior when it's still small, we address it for we can save their life so they don't have to leave the wrong way, so they don't have to go out and relapse, so they can address it, hopefully learn from it and grow from it, and then move on. Or we sit there and hold our mud because we want to project this image that we're tough guys, we're gangsters, we have such a low opinion of ourselves that we're more worried about what someone else's opinion is, and in the meantime, we let them destroy their lives.
So that's just an example of a relationship between what we do as a practice in the therapeutic community and what characteristic we think we're addressing in there. But the general theme of this entire segment of our discussion has really been, what are some of those characteristics that comprise the substance abuse disorder? Like, in effect, we had a view of the disorder as a view of a disorder of the whole person, and now I've been actually describing a second view, which was the view of the person. And that what we mean by the view of the person are these typical characteristics. Not every substance abuser has all of these characteristics, but some substance abusers do display all of those characteristics, and all substance abusers show many of those characteristics. So they have enough shared characteristics. So living in a treatment program like a therapeutic community is the basis for them essentially being to help each other in beginning to modify those characteristics. So two views govern what we do in the therapeutic community. The way we see the disorder as a whole person, we're trying to change much about the individual, and then specifically who that person is, what's some of those characteristics that need to be changed. So the very social organization of the program, the daily plan of activities, the groups, the meetings, the privileges, the sanctions, words that I'll talk about in a few moments, but all of this, which begin to comprise the program, are all designed to basically address the whole person disorder and some of the specific characteristics that I've just talked about. But there are two other views that basically govern what we do. That is why we have those elements and why those elements are in the treatment program called essential. And that is kind of a third view, a view of recovery, how people change. Therapeutic communities have a view about how individuals actually begin to change, how they recover from their substance abuse disorder. And that view of recovery basically rests on really several key assumptions. If you were to ask therapeutic community workers and participants, how do they change? How does recovery come about, or at least get initiated in a therapeutic community program? we say that one of the first assumptions about how it unfolds is that it's learning. In fact, even the word treatment, which is the commonly used word, and that's the way the programs are funded, but treatment doesn't really capture so much of what goes on in the therapeutic community because it's a total environment. Many things have to change about that individual in the environment, and much of the process that's involved in that change involves learning or relearning. So that in many ways we see it as a very complex social learning process, even though that term social learning, that phrase, is used in many contexts. Recovery then is seen as a kind of developmental learning. And that is, the individual comes in, and what they learn at a first phase of when they come in needs to form the basis of what they're going to learn at the next phase in this program.
We're always aspiring to a phase that's ahead of the one that we're currently at, and as good role models and teachers, we're always able to teach from a position that's above the position that we're asking the student to grow into.
Certain aspects of their characteristics have to begin to be displayed early, and as they start to make changes in those, as they begin to learn how to handle feelings, begin to learn how to talk and communicate emotions in appropriate ways, that forms the basis for even more complex learning as they move into the next stage. So that learning is a step-by-step process. Because you're dealing with a whole person, in many ways the analogy has often been implied in terms of in therapeutic communities as a place where individuals actually grow up. And that phrase has been used. It's a rather dramatic phrase, but there are many former participants in therapeutic communities will see themselves as individuals who have actually not so much gotten over their drug addiction in the therapeutic community as much as that's the program of the place where I grew up.
That's what it was for me. It was positive growth. It taught me how to make steps and to grow.
It changed my whole outlook on people, my behavior, and I was able to sit there and actually take the corrective criticism and change my life.
It changed a lot. I grew up, man.
And what that means when you say grow up, you really essentially hear the kind of analogy to developmental psychology or simply child development, where the individual first learns to crawl, then learns to walk, and then learns to run. And in many ways we see as the individual moves through a therapeutic community, because a number of these characteristics that we're talking about basically have to be displayed, and then new characteristics, in many ways kind of the right way of living, has to be acquired. That's done developmentally. So recovery is seen as a kind of developmental learning process. That's one assumption about how recovery occurs. So that much of what we do in the therapeutic community essentially is designed to facilitate developmental learning. For example, therapeutic community programming is laid out in stages and phases. It's laid out in stages and phases because it permits the individual to basically begin a learning process which they can handle in small increments. In some ways, that's a developmental side of this, but it also reflects our understanding of the client's problems in terms of completion, delay of gratification, so that if we asked individuals to basically bite off more than they can chew, that would again defeat them in terms of a characteristic pattern of failure in anything they have tried. On the other hand, if you have a small phase like 2 months of orientation, where this is what you have to learn, and then if the individual is learning what they need to learn in the orientation phase, we haven't specified that yet, that essentially gives the individual a small enough increment of goal attainment that they can achieve.
For a lot of us that's in here, we never have completed anything, you know? So for some guy to get a certificate that says that he graduated from the East Lodge, welcome to the South Lodge, you know, like you go up in these rooms, these guys have their certificates up on a wall, or I'm sending this home to my mother, you know what I mean? Because people be 40 years old and never got a certificate for anything, you know? So it's really a way of giving the guys some self-worth, some accomplishment. This is what I did, you know what I mean?
You know, I've seen a lot of growth in a lot of individuals standing here with these caps and gowns on. And it makes me feel proud to be a part of this, and I hope I influence you to keep you striving and guiding on the right direction, keep the right path.
And so basically the stage phase format in therapeutic communities, which we will talk about later, is really resting on the assumption that our clients basically need a format which will facilitate developmental learning in small enough increments to assure goal attainment. Otherwise they won't complete. So it's quite profound, but the structure of the format essentially reflects what we understand about the client's characteristics. Another very important assumption about how recovery unfolds in the therapeutic community is that we see it as fundamentally a self-help, mutual self-help process. Now, a lot of people use those terms. We should know a little bit about that. When we talk about self-help, at least as it is understood in therapeutic communities, we really mean that in the last analysis, unlike traditional treatment where we view treatment as something given to the client, provided to the client, classical treatment might be seen as provider-consumer, you know what I mean? I give you this medication or I give you this therapy, you know what I mean? And you take it and you change from that. Well, that's a kind of conventional view of treatment. But in therapeutic communities and in some similar kinds of approaches like the 12-step approaches, what we understand about self-help is that we say that the main contributor to the individual's change is the individual themselves. That is, they are the main contributor to their own change. When we say self-help, we say it is you that has to do something to change yourself.
It's a lot of hard work. You cry on a daily basis, but it's so worth it in the end.
It's a self-help program.
It is what you put into it. If you don't put nothing into it, then you're not going to grow anymore.
So in many ways, treatment in the therapeutic community is not so much provided as it is made available to them. And that means you have this environment, this complicated social psychological environment, which we'll describe a little later. This is the environment, sometimes called this community. You are here to use this community to change yourself. So the self-help part makes the point emphatically that if you're going to change, you have to do something. And so that's quite different than if I give you a pill or I give you an injection, which is I have to do something. And more passively, you just have to receive what I have to give you. Here we are implying a much more active process where the individual actually has to reach out and do something. And the word that we're going to talk about, of course, is the individual is going to have to participate. And if they participate, then they will change. And we'll come back to that phrase. But that self-help really means that the individual themselves are the main contributor to the change process. The phrase mutual self-help adds this element of mutuality, which is somehow my changing may be related to or affect your changing. That's the mutuality part of that. I'm in a social psychological environment where other people like myself, we're all working at change. And now the mutual aspect of self-help is that I will, in some ways, assist you in your own self-help process, and you will assist me. And that translates to I'm obligated to essentially continually observe you, give you feedback as to whether you are in fact doing the things that perhaps you could be doing to change yourself, and you are also observing me and whether I'm doing the things that I need to do to change myself. That's the mutuality of it. And in many ways, at the heart of that mutuality is not so much altruism, but the fundamental reality that your recovery is my recovery. And that is, if you are engaging in behaviors and attitudes which run contrary to how we're supposed to recover, what we're trying to learn here, that affects me. And same way, if I am essentially engaged in negative behaviors, that affects you. So it's not so much an altruism that underlies this mutuality, but a kind of realism, which is if I'm in a social environment, I need a social environment that's constantly positive and representing how we should be changing positively. So I observe it in you and you observe it in me. It's the heart of the matter in the therapeutic community methodology, which is individuals constantly providing feedback, sometimes confrontation, as to how they're actually behaving, because their behavior is not only essentially relevant to that person's recovery, but it's also relevant to my recovery.
Hey, everybody in this room knows I'm not shy about getting at you if I think you're being loud or if I think you're being disrespectful. Or, you know what? I'll be one of the first ones, you know what I mean? And there's a lot of, but there's also a lot of stuff that sometimes it's just you're banging your head against the wall.
I hear you, and I hear your struggle, Neil, but I think the main thing is that you get involved in supporting. You have to actually get involved in it before you have these preconceived notions on what it's gonna feel like, you know, to support. Start supporting, and you know what? It's that concept. A helping B so A stays well. Even if B, you know, continues to go down that path, you know that you're on the righteous path because you're trying to correct some wrongs today. And when you support others, you're supporting yourself. I mean, you have to adhere, you know, to the message that you deliver. So it's about walking the walk.
So mutual self-help and self-help is fundamental to the recovery process in the therapeutic community. That's an assumption. A third assumption in the TC's view of recovery is motivation. We all use that word, and we know that it means something about the individual having some movement toward change. And we know that the fact is that in all recovery, and in many change processes in general, motivation is constantly fluctuating. We're going to talk a lot more about motivation at a later point, but it's good right here to understand that the word motivation essentially means to move. And what we are really talking about when we say individuals are motivated in a therapeutic community, we really mean that they recognize that they have problems and they want to change, and then ultimately they will do some of the things that they need to do in order to change. That's the movement part of that.
Biggest motivation for me was when I caught my third strike and they were talking about giving me 25 to life. I've been in programs before, but I've always just kind of slipped through the cracks, did what was asked of me. But this time I honestly wanted to change my life. If I knew if I had another chance, this would be it. So I had to put some work in. I had to start talking about things that were bothering me, why I kept using drugs, why I was doing the things I do. And I don't know, that fear that was just inside me, I don't want to live like this anymore. I deserve a better life, you know what I mean? I want to be a father to my daughter.
But that problem recognition, which ultimately means I see some of the characteristics that I've got to change in myself, and they're much beyond the issue of my using drugs, but they may have to do with responsibility, authority, self-esteem, and so on. Constantly helping the individual recognize that they are working on and encouraging them to changing them. And that's the two components of motivation. I have a problem and I want to change. But that fluctuates on a daily basis in a therapeutic community, and much of what we do in the therapeutic community is designed to sustain the individual's motivation in the change process.
Good morning, family. Good morning, Judea. This is your morning meeting for Wednesday, 3/16/05. Can we please stand to say the philosophy? Our philosophy is. Our philosophy is. That every person has an important dignity and self-pride. That every person has an important dignity and self-pride. But pride is like a young sapling. But pride is like a young sapling. That must be trained, channeled, and nurtured. That must be trained, channeled, and nurtured.
Good morning, family. Good morning, Michelle. I too have 90 days clean.
Good morning, family.
Hi, good morning, Lucy.
Yesterday I got my results from my assessment test. I took it real home to college, and I impressed myself. I scored high enough to get an AA degree in English.
So again, we're back to this very fundamental idea that the therapeutic community perspective, its views, in this case the view of recovery, and within this view, motivation, justifies why we do certain things in the therapeutic community, in this case, to sustain the client's motivation. A fourth element or assumption of the therapeutic community view of recovery is that in the last analysis, it's a complex social learning process. That is, because the individual has a wide array of behaviors and attitudes to change, comprise their disorder, an efficient way that they can address all of that is if they are in various roles. Roles are really collections of behaviors and attitudes. So that if in a therapeutic community, if an individual, for example, is in a very typical work role in the community, which we might call an expediter, one who essentially is involved with being part of the eyes and ears of the community and facilitating things in the community, it's an expediter role that the members of the communities will be in. The expediter role, as an example, essentially consists of a variety of behaviors, attitudes, and even in some cases some emotional elements. So that by putting the individual in a role, having expectations about how they should perform in that role, the treatment program is now putting the individual in a situation where a variety of behaviors and attitudes can be confronted. That is, they can see how they actually talk to other people, how they receive criticism from the community, how well they report what's going on in the community, whether they feel afraid or vulnerable in that, whether they get too hostile or too violent in that. So just by putting them in that role, you give the individual an opportunity to display some of the behaviors and attitudes that we think comprise their disorder, and it gives us, and therefore, an opportunity to change those.
You're a role model in this house. People look up to you, and you know, it's been said that there was a new baby that was really offended, and I personally feel that that's something that you should maybe take a look at.
Yeah, she came out really strong.
I have some feedback, Margaret. When I was here, and I can only speak on when I was here, when I was coordinator, sometimes the house will make you spin. And sometimes you will, not intentionally, but the way you say things that come out wrong. And, you know, they say if one or more people say that, just take a look at it.
I was coordinator here too, and when I was coordinator here, I was the only coordinator. There was no AM, no PM, it was just me because somebody left, and it was crazy. But you know, I just want you to think about this and remember this, that what it teaches you when you go out there is an invaluable lesson. So, you know, being pulled in the circle, you know, reacting, I reacted to people all the time because I was going crazy and I didn't even realize it. But just take the lesson that you're going to learn from this position, and because it's going to be a good one. Trust me on that. It's going to be a really valuable lesson that you're going to learn from this position.
So what we mean by social learning, we mean that by using various social roles in the community, such as expedited, this one illustration I gave you, and even the friendship roles in the therapeutic community, that's another role. How to be a friend in the therapeutic community. And a classical view of friendship on the street, it has all kinds of implications about essentially doing things together, very frequently negative things together, not snitching on one another, not pulling each other's covers, right? That's also a friendship, you know what I mean? There we know that's a friendship that we would essentially call a negative friendship. In dramatic terms in the therapeutic community, we would say a real friend is one who is actually going to be continually pointing out what you're doing that's self-destructive. That's a real friend. A real friend will actually, in fact, snitch on you. A real friend will really essentially expose you to other people in the community because the things that they're exposing are negative and destructive to you. That's a real friend.
For me, friends co-sign my wrongdoings because it benefited them. But genuine friendship, I would have to say, is someone who is not willing to co-sign my bullcrap, you know, someone who's gonna speak up and let me know you're doing wrong.
And so that changing the whole friendship relationship in therapeutic communities, which is the kind of role you play as a friend, you know what I mean? What kind of a friend will you be? Is a very critical role, but it's again involves a wide variety of behaviors and attitudes which then in the friendship role are capable of being surfaced and seen and changed. So when we talk about social learning, we say in the therapeutic community approach, it uses roles, various social roles, because that's very efficient. because a wide variety of behaviors and attitudes can be displayed in any given moment and addressed. Well, look, what we've been talking about in this third view is how therapeutic communities view recovery. It's developmental learning, that is, it's done in small goal attainment increments and continues much beyond even the treatment program. It's primarily a self-help, mutual self-help process. It fundamentally is focused on sustaining the individual's motivation in the change process. It uses a variety of social roles to capture the whole constellation of behaviors and attitudes that often have to be changed. So in seeing this view of recovery, it again begins to justify why the therapeutic community in itself has to be a fairly complex social psychological environment to essentially achieve its ultimate treatment goals of changing the whole person. The fourth view that comprises the overarching therapeutic community perspective is a view that we have termed a view of right living. We talked about the view of the disorder as a disorder of the whole person. We talked about the view of the person in terms of a number of typical characteristics that need to change. We talked about the therapeutic community's view of recovery, which is some of the basic assumptions about how people change in the therapeutic community. And now we're talking about this fourth view, which we're calling the view of right living. And of course, that language, of course, moves off psychology, so to speak, and talks a little bit more about maybe philosophy, how people should live. Unlike a number of other treatment approaches, the therapeutic community is very distinctly influenced by values. It has a view of how people should be living correctly, healthfully in life. And it tries to teach that as part of its basic treatment approach. Now, while very few people would argue with some of these teachings because they're very attractive teachings that you find in many other areas of social intercourse. For example, therapeutic community insists on living truthfully and honestly. A lot of people would not argue with that. It insists on living in the here and now. We'll talk a little bit about that. It teaches that an individual is responsible for their own destiny. There's another value. They teach the value of social responsibility, namely brothers, sisters, keeper. There's very clear moral code around right and wrong behavior. Therapeutic community teaches it's wrong to lie, it's wrong to cheat, it's wrong to be violent, it's wrong to be sexually exploitive, it's wrong to use drugs. They don't say, it's simply an easy thing. They insist that it's wrong behavior. They have, in other words, a clear moral code. You don't lend money, you don't borrow money, except once you've learned how to be quite responsible and so on. It has a great commitment to the idea of the work ethic. Therapeutic communities try to teach that individuals should acquire a work ethic in the classical sense of that phrase. And of course, these are examples of some of the values that are taught in the therapeutic community. And while it looks like strictly a kind of a philosophical aspect of the therapeutic community, it actually is more than that. Because the therapeutic community recognizes that in the process of rehabilitation, returning an individual to a lifestyle that they once knew and rejected, that's what the word rehabilitation means, that individuals might have at one time had good values for living, but lost those or rejected them as part of their substance abuse disorder, and they may have to relearn them or have them reinforced. That's part of the rehabilitative process. But it also recognizes that a number of the substance abusers in treatment have never had a lifestyle with any values to guide them in their lives.
Values? What are those? I mean, I never had any values, man. Have gun, will travel. If you say job, I say bad joke. I'd rather go rob somebody who worked 5 days a week and take their check. Values. The only value I had was, man, I just didn't have them.
And so for them, essentially, their recovery also involves habilitation, learning how to live correctly, healthfully, properly for the first time in life. Values, which are essentially guidelines to help the individual sustain their positive learning, sustain their recovery in the world once they leave treatment. That it's very important to recognize, for example, the relationship between teaching the value of honesty and the fact that many of our people have been dishonest and essentially been manipulative. So that once they buy into the value, learn the value of honesty, it helps to reinforce their honest behavior, which we know essentially it is a correction of their earlier dishonest behavior. So there's a relationship between the values that are taught and the view of the client and the view of the disorder. So values are there not only to help provide a general guideline in life, but to reinforce what has been the actual positive learning in the recovery process. Whatever elements we have in the therapeutic community and whatever we practice in the therapeutic community basically has its justification in one or all of these views. So that why we do what we do ultimately needs to be explained in terms of the therapeutic community perspective.